So, a musical phrase is basically a short musical statement. And usually it's about the same length as an entire breath. So, two-ish bars is a pretty common length for a musical phrase. And I've heard a lot of people explain phrasing and say it's a lot like sentences in language. It has something of like a beginning and a middle and an end. Often a sentence has a few different parts to it. Maybe there's some commas within it where you take a breath, but it kind of is a completed little miniature story or a miniature statement. So musical phrasing is very similar to that. Now, musical phrases having a sentence-like pace and meter to them makes a lot of sense for a few reasons, but one of it is so much of our musical, traditions come from song. And song is, words put to music. And you have to talk and you have to breathe. And there's places where there's commas and there's periods. And you kind of get that sense in musical phrases as well. So if we take the melody Greensleeves, the first phrase would be something like this. The second phrase. Now, when it comes to dynamics of phrasing, we'll start by looking at the dynamics of an individual phrase. Now, because usually this corresponds in a lot of instruments, in song, in winds, in brass, this usually corresponds to a single breath. So usually the dynamic arc of a single sentence has something of a bell curve shape. So it starts softly, builds a little bit, and then will tail off and end. And it's actually pretty similar with strings as well. So like, take a phrase out of Scarborough Fair. Da, 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 da. Or the Force theme from Star Wars. Da, 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 da. Or Ode to Joy. Da, 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 dun, da, da, dun, dun, da, dun. Da, 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 dun, da, da, da. Now, within that kind of general bell curve shape, the dynamic direction doesn't have to do only that. There can be shapes within those shapes. And often the dynamics can follow a bunch of different parts of the melody, like large intervallic jumps, like Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Somewhere over the rainbow. Upward or downward runs, like in Carol of the Bells, it goes. The dynamics might follow little melodic turns, like in Back to the Force theme. Or it might follow points of accent, like maybe in a song like Happy Birthday. So in other words, the dynamic direction will usually follow points of interest in a melody. It's things that are musically interesting or more likely to be enjoyable, more likely for the performer to get into in a way. And you might notice that if you just step away, from your jaw and just sing a melody, I mean, you don't have to physically step away, but just like hum a melody, sing a melody in your head that you know well, you'll find that you're automatically adding dynamic contrast and rises and swells in certain spots. I mean, like, for example, try this. Take the pentatonic scale. And just sing it to yourself. Take a few seconds, just sing that to yourself. Now, you might notice, like, if you do a lot of scales, you might be careful to make sure that every note is totally even at the same dynamic. But if somebody said, hey, sing that musically, there's a good chance you find yourself actually creating these dynamic swells automatically, like da 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 da. Now, usually when something is emphasized dynamically, it's emphasized by adding volume or accent. But that's not the only way to add emphasis. Basically, you're trying to make some kind of contrast. Either everything else is at this dynamic and your point of emphasis or point of attention sticks out because it's dynamically louder, or it can also stick out by being softer and by focusing on the delicacy of a sudden soft transition. So like in the song Somewhere from West Side Story, it's like the loud, soft, da, da, loud, soft, da, 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 da. And you might think that arriving note should really get the highest dynamic, but this flips the script, and in doing so, it really makes the sense of calm and beauty on that dun, dun, place. On the arrival note, it sounds so delicate. It's really easy to become divorced from feeling and emotion in your music when you're like sitting here with a mouse and keyboard and you're working in your DAW. At least I find that to be the case, because I'm zoomed in on a note and on a process and on little tiny tweaks. And when I'm doing that, it's very easy for me to forget the overall flow of the music and the musicality of the music that I might keep in context if I'm, say, performing the piece from beginning to end. Or if I'm listening to a piece from beginning to end, as a listener, I'm getting kind of that overall emotional context. Sometimes that gets lost in deep DAW work. So a suggestion that I have for you, I find this really helpful sometimes, is when I'm writing a piece, writing a theme, whatever it is, to actually literally step away from my DAW for a minute and try to hum or sing the music in my head. Try to imagine it there. And while I'm doing that, I'll try to take careful note of what I'm doing dynamically or what I'm doing with time. And we'll get into that in a later lesson. Where am I slowing things down or speeding things up? And then after I've enjoyed the music in my head for a little bit without the constraints and the technicality of this, I'll take note of what I was doing, and then I'll come back to my workstation and apply basically that dynamic planning to what I'm doing in my DAW. And you can do this by singing, or you can do this by humming, or really any way in which you really emotionally connect with the music. So maybe it's by playing your main instrument away from the DAW. Maybe it's, violin, maybe it's singing, maybe it's guitar. I also find that sometimes when I play like a real piano that's somewhere else, because piano is what I'm most comfortable on, that sometimes it kind of unlocks musicality instincts that I don't always have when I'm sitting right here. So go to that happy place, that musical place, take notes of what you were doing expressively, musically, and then take those notes, take those applications back into your DAW environment. Now, oftentimes there will be a larger musical idea or melody that's made up of a bunch of little phrases all working together, all working in unison. So how do we dynamically plan not just those individual phrases, but how do we stitch them together to make an overall dynamic plan for like a whole musical sequence? Now, in Western European, I guess, music, a super common concept that we have, and it's not just in music, it's in a lot of aspects of culture, is like an idea and then the idea restated. The idea and the idea repeated. And this kind of makes a couplet, a two. And then we take this two and we multiply it out into 4, into 8, into 16. And the result is that a really common song structure and subsequently musical structure in Western music is the 8-bar melody or the 16-bar melody. And very commonly, these are made up of 4 different phrases kind of linked together. And each one has a little bit of a common function. And usually each one's, about 2 bars long or about the length of a single breath, a comfortable breath when singing. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be this way. You can use any number of phrases of any length. But I think there's a benefit to just getting into norms, things that are common and things that are expected, that the listener will be subconsciously expecting when he or she is listening to your music. So the function of these four phrases is usually something like this. There will be the main hook, the main idea of the theme stated in the first phrase. So like, again, if you take the Force theme from Star Wars. Da, 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 da. And then the second phrase is going to be the same idea repeated, but with a little bit of variation. Dun, da, 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 da. And then the third phrase is usually where things become a little bit more emotionally turbulent, a little more wild, and we go further from our home base in that third phrase. Dun, da, 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 da. And then our fourth phrase, usually we go back to our original idea and bring things back home. Da, 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 in a nice, resolve-y way. Same deal, Ode to Joy. Dun, 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 dun. Those are the first two bars. Dun, 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 dun. And then back to number 4. Dun, 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 dun. And we bring the original idea back to home base. Now, you may have noticed that in those melodies, that third phrase, which is like the different phrase, it's the black sheep one that does something different, does something a little bit unexpected and a little bit fresh. That is often the place where the most emotional turbulence is found. And that's often where the most tension is before things are brought back home. So a very common dynamic shape across the 4 bars is something like, phrase 1, phrase 2, phrase 3, and then phrase 4. So we kind of have our overall arc is something like that. Boom, 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 boom. The dynamic mountain range is something like that, I should say. So let's go back to the Force theme from Star Wars. I'll play it with violin, and we'll take a look at the shape. And we will literally look at it. And as you can see, there's these 4 phrases, and each one basically follows this, has its own little curvature, its own swell up and down, but then they're all working towards the highest point, which is the third phrase, and then back down in the fourth. Same idea in Scarborough Fair. Phrase 3 is the one with the most dynamic turbulence. This is going to be the dynamic peak. So in the overall structure, this very common is phrase 1's like this, phrase 2 is growing a little bit more, phrase 3 is the largest peak in your dynamic mountain range, and then phrase 4 comes back down. Now, you don't have to follow that structure, and in a lot of cases, that's really not going to be appropriate because, it's not always an 8-bar melody. Sometimes it's a film or a game track or something ambient, and it could be whatever. But that might at least give you a starting point for thinking about how you craft dynamic shapes in your own musical ideas. So whether you use that structure or not, something to think about is, what is the overall shape that I want my musical statement to have? And then what is the shape of the shapes inside that shape, and how do they work towards that larger goal? So how do we express the melodies with dynamics in an actual piece? Let's say in an actual something that we're making with virtual instruments. How do we do it? As we discussed, we could do it at least 2 ways dynamically. We can do it with automation and controller codes, or we can do it with velocity and probably short articulations. I'm going to go ahead and start with I'm gonna pick Scarborough Fair. It's pretty straightforward and direct. I'm going to see. I'm gonna back up a little bit here. I actually got. I'm gonna do this right here. I went ahead and picked a tempo that is pretty, nice and slow. I'm gonna go ahead and record the melody in. Let's see. All right. I used retrospective record because I didn't press record the first time. All right. So let's take a look at that. Take a look at the shape of that. All right. Same idea. Each one of these phrases has got basically its own dynamic shape. And this is going to be the emotional pinnacle. I actually want it to be a little bit more than that. So I'm just going to boost CC11 a little, which on my instruments is controlling the dynamics. And there's a lot of things I would do to clean this up if I was actually going to, like produce it properly. Like there's a bunch of repeated notes in this melody, and some of them I didn't even record properly here. So that's something I would clean up later. But for the purposes of this lesson, I'm going to leave it as is. I'm going to go ahead and record a full strings part to go along with this. And if I had an expression pedal, I could probably control the expression of the entire pad while I record with both hands. I don't. So I'm just going to record it. And then I'm going to create the basic shapes that I know I'm going to want. So let's give this a try. All right, I played a wrong chord in there, so I'm going to open that up. Take a look. There we go. Just kind of adjust the notes of that chord real quick. Let's give that a try. Okay, so I'm going to just actually draw in the basic dynamic shaping that we know we're using with our melody. Da, 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 da. So it's going to be da, 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 da. Da, 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 da. So I want to hold the last note out a little bit longer. So that's generally the dynamic template I would use for something like this, in an over kind of like, kind of the overall shapes. If I was going to do this more quickly, if I was going to do this more properly, I would probably do more of these recorded as individual lines. As you can see, like I had some submotion moving in between these chords, which would be really nice with like a viola patch, like carrying those all on its own. And I would probably do dynamic shaping that's follows these basic shapes, but would be slightly different based on the needs of each individual line. But at least there you can get a little bit of a taste for how you might start to build a dynamic structure for something with lush longs, kind of like this. This is a piece called The Upward Call, which I wrote as a demo for Orchestral Tools Metropolis Arc 2. And there's a couple things about this piece I'm going to be showing you in this course, but I want to show you some of the phrasing here. So let's take a look. Start out by opening up the piano, and I'll discuss basically the structure of this melody. There's kind of a first phrase, second phrase, which is the kind of idea sort of repeated with the variation, and then the phrase number 3 and 4 kind of connect together into one big swell and then descent dynamically. Now, in this piece, the fourth phrase is not a direct reiteration of the initial idea. It just kind of continues this phrase 3 idea. But you can see dynamically, if you look at the velocity here, you can see, let's take a listen. You can see what's going on. Now the build. Now coming down. Then a little bit more of a lean in. And then right back down to a very soft dynamic. Now you might notice something I do a lot is that when I have a swell, I mentioned this with my longs with controller codes, but you can see it here with velocity as well. When I have a swell, like up to here, this kind of swell shape, I am not putting the peak right in the middle of the swell or right on the middle bar. I'm actually bringing the dynamic peak a little bit before, because I often like to descend dynamically before I reach that middle point. So take a listen. When I arrive at that middle point, I like to oftentimes arrive softly, arrive at a soft dynamic coming down. Now, this same melody is repeated again with choir. It's slightly different towards the end as it leads into the climactic finale, but let's go ahead and open this up. So we're starting to build generally normative swell shapes. Back down. And this is just going to keep building up to the finale instead of coming down. We still have some dynamic shapes, but they're going to lead us right up into our big build. So that's what the choir is doing. Brass and woodwinds. We're using valleys here. Da, 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 da. Valley shapes are really nice for builds and big climactic moments like this. I like to use them for that a lot. Look in the strings. Now my strings, the peak is a little bit after the beat because I want to have them kind of like pulse and lean up into that peak. So in this finale, this da 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 da, the peak that all these shapes are building up to is right here, bar 41, and the peak of that is just over the ridge. So it's shape, 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 shape within shape, all together creating this larger dynamic crescendo, and we get a whole extra 2 bars here at the end to give it time to slow down, to hold, and then slow down for our little tag ending here at the end. And as we discussed, you can also make dynamic shapes with shorts. So if I had a piece like Carol of the Bells which works great for shorts because it has that repeated pattern, which gives us a bunch of information with which to create our dynamic swells. There's a bunch of different things you can do. Now, if I open up what I just recorded, you can basically see in the velocity, you can see the dynamic shapes that I'm creating. These basically the same swells, just good old swells. Now, if you were going to decide how to dynamically plan something like this, there's a couple of different ways you could go. I mean, there's so many ways you can go. But let's start with our opening phrase. So the right hand is more or less just an ostinato pattern, and it's giving us rhythm. It's kind of coloring what's going on, but I would say that's not really the melody in this first part. What's more interesting to me is what's happening in the left hand, this bass part. So if I was going to phrase this, I would probably dynamically, I would want to follow the direction of that left hand. And then let's get into our right hand melody. And then once we get to the runs, that can go a lot of different directions dynamically, but runs are a great place to do the dynamic swell. So you could start loud, then go soft. And lead into a quiet repeat, or you could do it quietly. And lead into a very violent repeat. It could go a bunch of different ways. This video lesson was made from content taken from a course of mine called Bringing Virtual Orchestra Music to Life, Volume 1, Expression, Dynamics, and Performance. In this course, I attempt to bridge the gap between musicality and technology by sharing in-depth techniques for applying timeless principles of musical expression to virtual orchestra instruments. If you're looking to level up the realism, authenticity, and lifelikeness of your music, then consider checking out the link in the video or in the video description. Thanks for watching.